Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the Silky Smooth Sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host Scott Parkin in San Francisco, California today. And as always, I'm joined by
Bob Bazanko, still in Ohio.
Yep. And today we are going to be talking about a very important and topical issue, which is not in the mainstream media enough, but is in a lot, and it's definitely in movement media. We're going to actually be, this is one of our days where we talk about labor. And so today we're going to be talking with Abby Lawlor, who is an attorney, an organizer, and researcher, and currently a legal fellow at the Public Rights Project. She is the co-author of Rules to Win By, Power and Participation in Union Negotiations, co-authored with Jane McAlevey. Abby, welcome to the Green and Red podcast.
Thanks so much. It's great to be with you both.
Yeah. And just maybe to kick it off, question about the book is, can you tell us about what are the rules to win by? What is some of the premise of the book?
Yeah, the premise of the book was really to give a hard look at how unions are engaged in the negotiations process, and in particular to uplift examples of what we call high participation negotiations. So negotiations that are big, open, and transparent. I can dig in a little bit more about what those terms mean and how we use them in the book. But the idea was really to build on Jane's previous work, No Shortcuts, which a lot of folks are familiar with, which was really kind of a organizing primer, an organizing 101. And we've taken that same approach, which is, we exercise power as a labor movement and as organized workers by building structure and reaching the capacity to take action as a majority of workers within a workplace, or a majority of tenants within a building, whatever it is, but that our power comes from taking action as large groups of people acting together, to take that approach and that philosophy and apply it to union negotiations. And so we quite literally have in the opening of the book 20 elements of high participation negotiations, or 20 rules that we urge unions to adopt as they enter the negotiations process, both because we argue it means you win more in negotiations, you're actually more successful in winning strong contracts, higher wages, better benefits, and because it's how you build a stronger union, a stronger organization that's able to take on fights even beyond the negotiation process. So to get back to those three terms, right, transparent, big, and open. For us, transparent means that there's no gag order that workers and folks on the bargaining committee enter into on the first day of negotiations. It's a remarkably common practice for unions that they actually agree to upfront rules in negotiations that say, the folks in this room are not going to share with the rest of the workers covered by the collective bargaining agreement what's going on in these conversations. So that's like rule number one is no gag orders, that everyone should be able to find out quickly what is going on in those negotiations at a really high level of detail, and that there are no.
How do the bosses use gag rules to their advantage?
Yeah, I think it's really hard to have people organize and exercise their power. Ultimately, I think exercise their power in building towards a strike vote and holding a strike over the issues that are being negotiated at the table if workers have no idea what those issues are or the status of particular proposals, right? If people don't know fundamentally what they're fighting for, what they're being asked to go on strike for, that's just a huge barrier to people being willing to take that really risky militant action together. So obviously, I think it's entirely to the boss's advantage to keep what's going on secret, because people are going to check out if they don't know what's going on and if they don't know the stakes of what's actually on the table. So that's transparent. And then in terms of big in that element, big means having a really big negotiating committee, so a large group that's actually making the decisions about proposals. And big also means that it's representative of all of the different departments in a particular workplace. And then if people engage in shift-based work, it makes sure that you have people representing the day shift and the night shift. Those folks may have different issues, but that all of the different kind of divisions within the workplace are actually represented on the committee that's making the decisions and negotiations, because they're going to have the knowledge about the particular issues in their area. They're also incredible fact checkers. So if the boss comes in and, says, oh, we have no staffing problems in a particular department in the hospital, that workers are sitting at that table that can say, no, we're constantly short-staffed. You're constantly calling me to come in on my day off, right? They're sort of real-time fact checkers for what management says in negotiations. And then we also really stress the importance of having elected members of that committee so that coworkers are selecting, in the context of thinking about negotiations and thinking about what they want to win, are selecting the coworkers that they think will best kind of represent them in that process. So that's big. And then finally, open, the idea that any worker who's covered by the collective bargaining agreement can actually come and attend negotiations and watch and see what happens. And the goal that we set, the aspiration, is really that every single worker who's covered by the agreement will at least come to one session and see what it's like and see actually the back and forth with management.
Bob, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I think one development we've seen a lot, and for a while now actually, has been that the type of labor organizations that exist tend to be smaller. You no longer have these steel mills with thousands of workers, or Lordstown or Packard or GM over here where I am in Ohio. How does that change the nature of organizing and negotiating when you're dealing with kind of fairly small and often independent units like Starbucks or particular Amazon warehouse or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some great things that come with smaller units, just in terms of it's a lot easier to get everyone to come to negotiations. If it's a smaller unit, it's less of a lift in terms of communicating more broadly. And so I think it's a lower barrier in terms of some of these techniques that we're talking about. On the other hand, right, our power comes from numbers. So when you're a much smaller unit, particularly like a small Starbucks unit within a much larger company, you're just up against a massive power imbalance in terms of being able to organize and win a really meaningful contract through collective bargaining. So I think, that raises the importance of one, I think, thinking strategically about how to build power within local labor markets, and thinking about, even if we're not going to build density within Starbucks across the country right away, could we build in particular locations, or say, on college campuses where there's a contract with a university that students and others can weigh in on, thinking about just the kind of geography of the organizing and building power in kind of site-specific places. And then the importance of also coordinating and lining up negotiations across multiple shops or across multiple employers. There's an example in the book of hotel workers doing this in Boston, where workers across a bunch of different hotel companies worked to line up their contract expirations. So they all expired at the same time. And then workers were able to, in the thousands, be at the negotiating table at the same time, making the same demands, as opposed to taking on those fights just 100 workers at a time in a more scattershot way, so that they were able to build power together and to make this strike threat as a group of thousands of people across 34 hotels instead of a small group of workers at one hotel.
As I was reading and thinking about the high participation, high powered negotiations, it seems like it's the sort of thing that would not be to the boss's advantage, that they would work to undermine that. And, labor law seems to be very much, I've heard it referred to as boss's law. And it is, sort of built to actually be for the benefit of the owner class and the employer class and that sort of thing. And so, as we sort of move through trying to get into this like high powered, high participation negotiations, how are the bosses actually trying to undermine it, in anywhere along the process?
Yeah, I mean, certainly at every turn, it's something they're they're seeking to undermine. And I would say too, it's important to identify that, when workers are first organizing and fighting for union recognition, that is a moment in which they face really intense anti-union campaigns from their employer. There's tons and tons of employer spending on hiring outside consultants, on waging mass campaigns of disinformation and just spreading lies about the union in that effort. We see the same thing happen when workers are fighting for a first contract, where the employer is using all of those same techniques to make sure that, okay, even if workers were able to win an NLRB election, they're never going to get a first contract. That's what we're seeing at Starbucks, right? That's what we're seeing at Amazon. They've thrown down, they've gotten the second opportunity to try and bust the union by just never agreeing to a contract. And so I think, these techniques,
They're a form of non-cooperation.
Yeah. We hope that these techniques are a way for workers to kind of overcome that, and to, in the same way that they have to really build power through mass participation to win recognition, that same approach will be successful in getting a first contract. And there's kind of a scene that happens over and over in the book where workers show up for the first day of negotiations, and it'll be a room with chairs for 25 people, and 150 or 200 workers show up to negotiations. And there's this immediate fight with the boss about, well, are we going to get a bigger room so that all of these people can actually attend negotiations? Just the practicality of, okay, what space are we in, and does it fit all of the people who are going to be here? Or getting the employer to use a microphone, right, so that everyone who's there can actually hear what's going on. And there'll be immediate employer resistance there. I think we emphasize over and over that you can't back down from that initial fight. There's this, I think there may be this worry that, oh, we're going to spend all of this time and energy just fighting about what room we're in. We should just move on to negotiations. And I would counter that and say, you need, if you're not going to win that fight over what room negotiations are in, you're not going to win that fight over the pension, over healthcare, whatever is coming down the road. So it's just a really important fight to take on, and kind of an initial threshold test of your structure and organization and people's willingness to make that demand for space in which everyone can be there and participate. I would say the other thing that is part of kind of our 20 elements that we emphasize is that the boss is always going to try and open a side channel where, their lawyer calls up the union lawyer and tries to make float proposals in secret, right? That people on the bargaining team don't necessarily know about, that the wider bargaining unit doesn't know about. And that's their mode of operation, is having the communication be through lawyers often, and having it be away from the main sessions where everyone is attending and participating. And it's so important that whoever gets that kind of back channel communication just rejects it outright and says, no, we are going to have these conversations in full negotiations, or if there's a reason to have a sidebar conversation, right, that's with permission from the negotiating team and with the ability for all of the information from that conversation to be reported back so that everyone knows what was discussed. But yeah, so they're kind of larger and smaller ways that the employer goes after the ability for workers to fully participate in their own negotiations, but those are some examples.
Yeah, I mean, in addition to the bosses, who obviously are the biggest problem, in the past probably decades, I've seen a lot of criticism of the union hierarchy itself, which is kind of, in many ways kind of taken upon itself this decision-making ability to cut out a lot of rank and file people, and really hasn't kind of, and I think we've seen in the last couple of elections and things like the steelworkers and Teamsters is kind of moving back toward a union democracy. But how important is that to make sure that this union hierarchy, these elected leaders really do represent their workers, and they're kind of off being cowboys on the side or whatever?
Yeah, I think it's so important. And we, unfortunately, unions in their internal democracy, it's suffer from a lot of the problems we see in our democracy more broadly, right? It's often really low turnout in elections for union officers, or folks are just end up in those positions by acclamation or by appointment. And so we often, we'll talk about union position holders separate and apart from leaders in the union, because often the people who end up in those positions are unfortunately not necessarily leaders in their workplace, or have large groups of workers who are following them or supporting the approach that they're taking. So yeah, I think that's a real problem. One of the things too that we talk about is using some of the techniques of power structure analysis, right, that we would use to evaluate the boss and to think about strategy in a campaign, to also think about that, for rank and filers to use that as a technique to think about how power exists within their own local union, and to look at the bylaws, to look at the constitution of their union, to figure out, okay, here are kind of the rules on the ground about how our union negotiates, and if they're a barrier to high participation, getting people to think about, okay, what would we need to do in order to change this, and how would we need to organize internally to pass a new bylaw or to change the internal structure of our union so that some of these reforms are necessary. Really excitingly, the Amalgamated Transit Union passed recently a possibly international resolution, because they're an international union, on the topic of open bargaining, right, and taking this approach in negotiations, encouraging their locals to take that approach. And it's an example of exciting organizing happening within a union to enable some of these reforms.
Have you all been out making presentations talking about the book with anyone from Amalgamated?
I know Jane has had a lot of conversations with them, and we're just next week are launching, it's kind of the second iteration that we've done through the Berkeley Labor Center, a training specifically for workers and for organizers on the book and the techniques in it. And so we're going to have someone from one of the ATU locals that's done high participation negotiations joining us to present as part of that. And then also we're going to have some folks from other ATU locals who are participating and being a part of that training.
This might be outside the scope of what you're talking about in the book, but when you kind of train people on how to negotiate, is that strictly kind of within the workplace, or do you kind of have another component which would involve community organizing or direct action or anything like that, to go beyond simply sitting down and talking about the nuts and bolts of a contract?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the examples in the book all draw on the work of labor unions, but we hope that it's a helpful set of principles for people organizing more broadly. We've had people from tenant organizing in particular participate in past trainings that we've done, and I think would encourage people to think about how the kind of structures that you have that are sort of ready-made in labor law and in the tradition of labor organizing can be used and implemented in other contexts. So like identifying a really clear boss entity that you're going after and making demands of, having a timeline for kind of escalating and building towards a real moment of crisis for that boss that you're pushing up against, and then actually demanding to have a binding agreement that you can enforce over time that is addressing some of the demands that you've made. I think are kind of elements that again are in part backstopped by labor law, but are things that people can create in the structure of organizing and in other contexts. And I think the aspiration of actually getting to the table and building enough power where you're able to engage in negotiations and you've forced the landlord or whoever it is to actually be sitting down across the table from you and really engaged in that back and forth is the right sort of aspiration in a lot of organizing spaces, not just in the workplace.
Yeah, I find it. I noticed. I remember this in No Shortcuts. My day job is I'm an organizer in like environmental and climate circles, and read No Shortcuts actually parts of it a couple of times. I've read the whole thing, but also read parts of it a couple of times. I noticed that there's a lot of references to like work that like environmental and climate groups could do to actually be more effective. I'm wondering. Particularly because this is where I work, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts of how some of the ideas in this could actually apply to some climate organizing, climate movement.
Yeah, I would say the starting place I would recommend is really doing the power structure analysis that's laid out in the book, if that's not something that you've done, to identify where the decision makers are, where the folks holding power are that you would want to make the target of a real organizing campaign, and then to really think about building structure. And the workplace has such a nice ready-made structure, and also is one of the few, there's obviously tons of segregation in employment, but also still one of the few places in society where you have a mix of people coming from really different backgrounds that are in this shared environment and under the kind of shared thumb of a single boss. And so thinking about where's your organizing base, and how to build structure, and kind of this idea of majority participation, even if the kind of parameters of who's in that group is not so clearly defined as it might be in a workplace. Those would be kind of my initial reactions.
You have something, or
I have a related question to
Yeah.
this, which I wanted to flag, and I think Bob's going to enjoy that I bring this up. You in the conclusion chapter is with a quote from Kamala Harris, which is, you don't want to watch sausage be made, and you don't want to watch a bill be made. Sometimes it's not a pretty sight, but in the end result, I mean, unless you're a vegan, of course, the end result is usually pretty good. And so it's Kamala's arguing for a lack of transparency in I think she was talking about Build Back Better. And I'm wondering, how some of what you talk about with open negotiations could have been applied to Build Back Better, or some of the other, bold legislation which never really got off the ground in the first 2 years of the Biden administration. But I also just like the I'll let that quote from Kamala.
It's like people want to understand things generally, I think, and especially when there are decisions that have such consequence for the future of our country being made. I think people really want to have some insight into that process. The thing I always think about around this is all of the votes around Kevin McCarthy, and just how everyone was like glued to C-SPAN actually watching, because we got to see, different representatives like going up to each other and having the side conversations, and just all of that kind of behind the scenes of that process that you don't normally get to see, because the cameras aren't just kind of roving around and showing you all of the back and forth, and people got to see all those different votes and the deals that were getting cut. And I think found it totally fascinating, because it was this insight into just the machinations of Congress that we don't normally get. And I think that's actually something that people are really hungry for and want, and also makes us smarter about how we engage in politics and engage in organizing, because we understand more what's going on in those rooms and what's going on kind of as the people casting those votes, making those decisions are weighing different factors. So it feels to me like a huge missed opportunity to build a much broader base of support for things like Build Back Better, right? For important legislative priorities, if you actually let people into that process and understand where the roadblocks are, and bring them into being a part of the broader strategy for how to move forward.
this is kind of a bigger issue rather than just like strictly union negotiations. But this isn't really the American people, I think polls show are increasingly pro-union, but it's not really a pro-union country. The Republican Party will go all in to take care of its people, and Joe Biden can tweet that I'm the most pro-union president ever, but the reality is he doesn't even support railroad workers. How do you both try to organize union and negotiate when you're not really in a political climate? I'm in Northeast Ohio, Youngstown, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, which used to be probably the most pro-union part of the country, and is heavily Trump now. And people who worked at GM and got great pensions now, reject the unions, and they blame immigrants, and they're, blaming everybody else for what's going on around here. Like within that atmosphere, that political climate, you have a Supreme Court where two of the so-called liberals just voted to punish unions who go on strike. That, to me, it would seem like that creates another fairly big barrier to organizing and negotiating. Like, how do you get around that, or how do you deal with it when you don't really have allies, or strong enough allies?
Yeah, so all of our case studies in the book There's one that comes a bit later that's workers in Germany, but otherwise the case studies all took place during the Trump administration, right? An administration that might profess to be the most anti-labor administration in history. And we really wanted to show that workers could still take on these fights, around the country, could take on these fights and win, even with an NLRB that did not in any way have their back, and in this climate of real attacks on unions and workers, because the folks in those campaigns relied on their core source of power, which was not support from a friendly administration or laws that were in their favor in any way. It was, okay, we're going to organize and build towards being able to make a credible strike threat, or if we need to actually take a strike. And that enabled them to win really amazing things, including things on issues where we would love to see the federal government or state and local governments take action, right? In Boston, again, hotel workers were able to achieve new rights on the job around the introduction of new technology in the workplace, things like robots that can clean rooms or deliver room service. It's an area where we really need new laws and rules around how technology is being used in society, the kind of data that's being collected on all of us, things like that. And workers were able to demand and win that at the negotiating table themselves because they built enough power and were on strike for 46 days. They won that demand. And so, yeah, the thing that we really wanted to illustrate through that example is we don't need to wait for an even more friendly administration for any changes to federal law. These are things that workers can and should be building power to win and winning now. And I think also the point I would emphasize is that if we want labor law reform, if we want a more favorable climate in which to organize, that's going to come from us having enough power to really make those demands and force the sausage makers to actually make those changes, and saying, oh, we can't really effectively organize until those changes are made is just a recipe, I think, for waiting and allowing union density and the labor movement to continue to decline.
Do you have something else, Paul? My question, and maybe you just answered it with what you said. My next question was around Janus versus Ask Me, which is, national right to work, essentially a case that the Supreme Court did in, I think, 2018. But I mean, how do you think one thing I've heard in post Janus from many of my friends who are labor organizers is that they say, I mean, they weren't happy that it happened, but they said a good part about it is it could actually motivate unions, particularly the big unions, to actually get to actually start going back to the work of organizing, or using strike as a weapon, or being more effective and not just doing side combos with industry lawyers or what have you. And I'm wondering how you think that the political landscape has changed since Janus, if it has, or have unions gotten more feistier, or have some is the dead weight getting just pushed off the cliff? That's those sorts of things.
Yeah, I think that how you describe that decision and kind of the trade-off. On the one hand, having the Supreme Court say that strip unions of this really important source of funding, right, which I think was the impetus of the decision from their perspective, right, to weaken unions by making it more difficult for them to have the financial resources to do the work that they do, right? That is a really bad thing. On the other hand, it also pushes towards, I think, some of the things that we would hope unions would be doing anyway, in terms of making sure that they're engaging a majority of workers within a workplace, that workers, are enthusiastically and wholeheartedly paying dues because they really believe in the organizing mission of the union, and they're invested in building that organization with their coworkers, rather than because, they're obligated to pay those dues, or they could lose their job if they're not paying those dues. So I think it kind of yeah, there's just this tension of the Supreme Court shouldn't be the ones deciding about, how unions are structured and funded. On the other hand, we should be engaging a majority of workers, and that should be kind of the backbone of our work and our movement. I was a member of UAW at the University of California for several years, and that was a union that, was in real trouble coming out of Janus, right? Did not have really a structure in place to be actively organizing and bringing new members into the union, and turned it around and built a really successful infrastructure for making sure that they were able to maintain not just majority membership, but supermajority membership, and to really build that level of organization. I think was something that led pretty directly up to the University of California strike last year, of just them having done that organizing work and really building that foundation that then enabled them to take this really massive strike action. So yeah, I think it's complicated, and but for a lot of unions, it has forced them to do real organizing work that expands possibilities and builds their power.
That's a question, but I just want to note that we actually did. I live in Berkeley, even though I'm in the city today. But like we actually did 2 shows because I have many grads who were part of that strike, who were
Awesome.
grad students there.
Yeah. I forgot what I was going to say. Go ahead. I need to write stuff down.
I mean, my question is this sort of like practical use of the book? And I'm curious about how, because this is actually one of the things that I appreciated from their shortcuts and the collective bargain, and it's like how do you all plan to use this as a tool to help organizing, like labor organizing, but also like other issue areas, other topics, other movement sectors, that sort of thing?
Yeah, the short answer is to get it in as many people's hands as possible. And we've been doing, as I said, some training through the Berkeley Labor Center to kind of bring folks together around the book and to have some structured conversations around the book. Would also encourage other people to consider reading groups or just coming together again with coworkers or with other people that they organize with to read the book and to discuss it with one another. I think another thing that Jane has been doing in part through their Nation column, and we're thinking about doing more of, is just highlighting, all of the unions that have come to trainings or read the book or a previous version of the book that was a report that came out through the Labor Center and are now going out and using these techniques and winning really big. So some of the ATU folks are an example of that, but just continuing to uplift all of the places in which workers are choosing to take a high participation route in their negotiations and are winning really amazing things at the bargaining table.
Yeah, I mean, it could be just because I'm in the sort of social media loop with a lot of labor organizing, things like that. But it seems like we're in this sort of like moment where there's a lot of. I follow More Perfect Union, for example, on Twitter, which is always talking about like they just want a contract, they just went on strike at universities and workplaces and small workplaces, and so I think introducing tools like this into the hands of like a new Gen Z millennial sort of like labor force, which is in the process of organizing as politics, which are left of center, is very important. I commend you for putting these tools out there. So just want to say that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and a thing that I both experienced in my own kind of time in the labor movement and certainly in talking with folks for the book is that workers often have just assumed that the way their union negotiates is how every other union negotiates, and people are lucky to have a union experience to begin with, but often will only experience one union's approach to negotiations and to organizing more generally. And so just being able to share, having more of those stories out there of actually what negotiations look like and what workers are doing, I think is really important and is happening in a lot of places in a really exciting way in this moment.
Yeah, about I think 2/3 of Americans are kind of supportive of unions, and I believe organizing numbers went up last year. But then you have states like Florida and Texas and Mississippi, Louisiana, which are making it far more difficult. For instance, Florida, I think, has gotten rid of the automatic deduction for union dues, and I'm sure Texas is going to follow suit. Um, are the ideas you have kind of still applicable to places like that, where you have a different kind of hostility than you might in, Massachusetts or New York or California or Maryland, and you kind of use these things kind of nationally?
Yeah, I would definitely say that they are applicable across the board. A lot of the techniques that we write about are ones that Jane has used throughout her career as a negotiator, including in Nevada, right, in a right to work state where actually having high participation negotiations was both a tool for winning really great contracts, but also building membership in the context of right to work, because members and workers who are not currently members of the union could all come to negotiations and actually see what was going on. And workers would come in not members, and then after seeing a session would sign up and join the union because they just saw and understood what the union was by seeing what happened in that negotiating room. Similar to Janice, right? The Florida law, both no dues deduction, and now you need not just 50%, but 60% of folks. And again, it's sort of a bad that this is a thing that is imposed by the state, but high participation is going to build a stronger union. We have an example in the book from the Massachusetts Nurses Association that has had their own direct dues program for many years. So they just decided they didn't want to rely on their employer to be the person who collected dues and controlled the flow of money in and out of their union. So they did the extra work of just signing everybody up and creating their own system for deducting that money directly, and has been, I think, a source of power and independence for that union. And so that's, again, these are things that kind of shore up our organizational strength and our independence from particular legal systems or from particular employers. But also it's just really shitty to have the attack coming from governments in the South, but not something that should hold people back in organizing.
I think that's it for our questions, unless Bob has anything else.
No, not really. I mean, if somebody came up to you, just, wanted like a really quick one or two ideas about, how to start organizing to either get recognized or get a better contract, like, is there something you could pinpoint to say this is like the best place to start, or this is the best idea to lead with?
Yeah, the initial step in terms of just building to high participation negotiations, really the thing that you're doing out the gate and it's a long lead up. A lot of these techniques take a lot of time. And so you really want to start a year plus out from when you're actually at the negotiating table. But the kind of initial activity that sets the tone for the whole process to come is the negotiating surveys, the tool that you use to actually collect input from all of the workers about what they want in the contract. And so I think putting a lot of thought into, okay, what kinds of questions are we asking and the feedback that we're soliciting, but more importantly, doing the work of, building the organizing structure, building the set of people such that you're able to get a majority of people in the workplace to actually fill out that survey. A lot of unions will distribute it, but then not actually track how many people filled it out, how many people were engaged, or track, right, who actually talked to their coworker about filling out the survey. What are the relationships that are being activated through the survey process? And so the survey is really the first step, both to signal the kinds of things that you might take on in the contract, but also to test your organizing structure and to see where people are at and the work that you need to do to build a stronger organization over the course of the lead up to negotiations. So yeah, contract survey is kind of step one in all of this.
Awesome. Folks, you've been listening to Abby Lawlor, labor lawyer, organizer, author, and co-author of Rules to Win By, Power and Participation in Union Negotiations. Abby, I want to thank you for joining Green and Red today. Folks, if you like what you're hearing, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. And if you want to make a donation, go to greenandredpodcast.org and hit the support button. or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. We'll talk to you all again soon. Don't forget to go make trouble and misbehave.